Hey everyone, we've been taking a look at Baroque painting and architecture and sculpture. I just wanted to examine how these ideas are moving beyond the borders of Italy and influencing areas like Spain. And so I wanted to focus on this kind of wide-reaching swath of the Baroque era. And this is going to then move northward to Belgium and the Netherlands. Just taking a look at a couple of images that I want us to think about in this kind of ongoing discussion of Baroque art and its complexity. Juan Sanchez Cotain was a Spanish painter from Toledo, Spain. He was a student of El Greco. We've talked about him before during the Mannerist style, but he became inspired by this new emerging style of Caravaggio. Right, so he's a pioneer of Baroque realism in Spain, and he's mainly known for his still lifes. And one day he gave it all up and gave all his possessions to live in a monastery. So it's kind of an interesting decision as an artist, right? But here we see with quince, cabbage, melon, and cucumber the simplicity of life, right? It's about naturalism to trick the eye to make it seem realistic. The master is to observe reality, to portray the world as accurately as possible, similar to the objectives of the Renaissance, but also a little bit different, right? So the fruit that you see in front of you is not ideal fruit. It's like realistic fruit that we would actually see in the store or that we would actually grow, right? So in some ways, it's real, but also deviates from reality, right? The fruit and cabbage dangle from a string, right? That's just kind of an interesting representation. And so there's an immense amount of negative space. But the idea of the time, the idea of the Baroque era, was to make something so real that you could fool birds to landing on the windowsill, right? So that's kind of that's his objective, right? To make it look so realistic, so natural, that a bird would mistake a painting for real life, right? And in some ways, that's also what we are to do as the viewer. We are to kind of suspend that reality, right? But this painting captures the essence of the Baroque. It's both real and staged. Baroque occupies the gap between the two, right? There is a theater about it. We go to the theater and we expect the actors to speak lines, but we also expect to get lost in the action and become part of the story, right? As we kind of immerse ourselves into it. Part of reality is suspended as we enter this fictional world. Baroque functions in a similar way, right? We enter this illusionary space and we know it's not real, but the artist presents it in such a realistic way that it seems real, that we can touch it. Similar to the ideas that we see a little bit, kind of that connection with Durer, where he starts to take a look at blades of grass or a piece of turf and suggest that is worthy enough to study, and Caravaggio and his still lifes, right? And suggesting that anything can be a subject if it's represented clearly, accurately enough, right? Here we see Ribera's The Club-Footed Boy, and this one he's a Spanish painter who moved to Naples and was one of Caravaggio's greatest disciples there, right? So kind of learning this new style. Here he depicts a small boy with a club foot, and he holds in his hands a note that says, "Give me alms for the love of God," right? So he's begging for food. We see the immense complexity of the Baroque era, right? So there's a lot of differences that are happening here, right? Part of it is about being grandiose, like the conversion of St. Matthew or Paul, or the ecstasy of St. Teresa, or as we've seen with the buildings, that the architecture that we've seen, it's about being overwhelming, like the canopy in St. Peter's. It's about being elaborate, like we see with Apollo and Daphne with Bernini's sculpture. But it's also about being grandiose, right? It's about and it's also about not being grandiose. It's about the little things in life and demonstrate how these simple moments are transcendent and important, right? So it's about the grandiose and the exact opposite. As we see with Caravaggio, it's about the little moments that make life great, right? Baroque captures the wide swath of human events and activities, like the conversion of St. Paul or someone peeling a piece of fruit, right? It can be about a wealthy person, or as we see here, a club-footed boy begging for food, right? So it suggests that life is complex with a wide tapestry of human events. Baroque kind of immerses itself in these qualities. Baroque can be about simple things, and simple things can make life great, complex, and amazing. It's the artist that can make the normal or the everyday significant, right? So that's what artists are seeking to do. Taking a look at Velázquez, he's probably the most important Spanish Baroque painter. He was born in Seville and he died in Madrid. He worked for mainly the Spanish court. Some suggest that he's probably one of the greatest painters in history because of his massive influence on later artists, particularly the Impressionists and everyone that comes after the Impressionists, due to his looser brushstroke rather than having that very tight, pristine brushstroke that we would see earlier in earlier works by earlier artists. He focuses more on this kind of haziness, and then artists of the modern world are really going to pick up on that and run with it. He petitions to be accepted to the Spanish court initially at a very young age in Madrid, but he's rejected, and so he returns to Seville and paints in the Venetian Mannerist style with this added influence of Caravaggio. So he's blending this kind of older style of Mannerism with this newer style of Caravaggio with the Baroque, right? He was later invited to do a portrait of the king, and then was invited to become part of the court painter. So initially he wasn't, but then he eventually does become. They see his talent, they see his skill. Here we see an image of a man of African descent, and he paints him with amazing accuracy and intimacy. We see the balance of the Baroque between the grandiose and the simple. We see amazing portraits of kings and queens with amazing elements, but we also see the amazing elements of mundane and the commoner. Together they show that kind of the richness of life, and it reminds us of what it means to be human. The subject, Juan de Pereira, was a slave and a servant of Velázquez, and then became his assistant in that time. And this was, as he exhibited this work, it was heralded as the most real work of the year, right? So people saw this and like, there's something amazing about it. Even though it has that fuzzy quality, particularly in the face and that, it still feels very realistic to us, right? The idea is to depict anything with accuracy and precision will bring out the divine within it, or the human within it, or the complexity within it, right? Everything can be a subject of art if the artist is truly looking at what is there, right? What's below the surface. The idea is to depict life in its complexity. Life is interesting. Velázquez recognized Pereira's talent and treated him as a valued equal collaborator. And then he also, working with him over the years, he decided to grant him his freedom, making him free from slavery. And this was a very rare act at the time. But it was Velázquez's way of kind of paying him back for all of the help and the insights and amazing artist that he was. And he continued his career as an independent painter and specialized in portraiture. And so Juan de Pereira continues on afterwards. But the way that Velázquez represents him kind of captures that realism. This one is when Velázquez was part of the Spanish court. Here we see a well-dressed girl, and she refuses a glass of water from her handmaid, right? So we see the little girl here at the very center, and then we see the handmaid kind of offering her a drink, and she's like, no, I don't want a drink. And then there's that bored dog at the very center, and a man leaving, or perhaps entering, not really sure, some ambiguity there, the room. The two people in the mirror are in the background, right? Or the portrait, or the King Philip IV and Queen Mariana. So it's not much about the court life as it is about maybe a royal portrait, except it's not really a royal portrait. It's kind of an interesting complexity here that's being represented, because the people being painted are barely in the picture, right? So who is really being painted here, right? Note at the time, Spain was in decline politically due to war and economic troubles, and the king lost his wife and son, the only heir. And so Margarita Teresa, this young lady here, was the only living heir, right? So she's front and center. She is the empire's future, right? Off to the side, we see Velázquez painting the image. But the question here, this is where the complexity comes in, is what is the painting about, right? Is it about the image that we're seeing, right? But if it's about the maids of honor, right, the artist is looking in the wrong direction, right? So he would be looking at the back of their heads, right? So it can't really be about that, right? Perhaps. Or two, is the painting of the king and queen reflected here? If so, we are standing where the king and queen should be, which is an interesting place to put us. Right? It's interesting to put us in the shoes of the king and queen, right? And it's interesting to put them kind of stuffed in the background rather than front and center, right? So again, maybe it's not. Maybe that's not even a mirror. Maybe that's a portrait. Right? I don't know. I mean, it is interesting how it's lit amid the dark backdrop of where it's at. So some suggest because it has that reflection in it, it must be a mirror, right? But the painting has various focal points, right? The focal point of Margarita Teresa, the focal point of this guy here, the focal point of Velázquez, and then the focal point of us. And so it's kind of interesting that this makes us more aware that we're peering in to this kind of moment in time of the royal family, which is quite unique, right? We're kind of invited in to see this kind of space. But the idea that there is this kind of confusion and complexity is another dynamic to Baroque art. What is the real meaning? What's the message, right? The complexity is this work of art is inviting us back to continually question, to continually think, right? This idea of the world is expanding, right? Maybe life is much more complicated. Maybe paintings shouldn't just give us simple answers. Maybe they should invite us in to think a little bit deeper about life, right? So this is the kind of a representation of what's happening in Spain and how Baroque art is transferring beyond the boundaries of Italy and some of the different complexities that we see with Baroque art, right? It can be about these big moments. It can be about little small moments. It can be about confusing moments, right? So it's about that richness, the richness of life.